remember what it was like, to experience a city as a kid.
Yeah.
Not all the grown-up stuff, but just how big everything felt. All the sounds, the discoveries you can make just around each corner. It's a kind of unique perspective, that we tend to lose as we get older.
It really is interesting how those early experiences we have, how they kind of shape how we see cities even years later. I think we have a tendency to design for what adults need, commutes, jobs, shopping. But what happens when we shift that focus and look at it from a child's point of view?
And that's what we're going to be diving into today, how designing cities with kids in mind can actually benefit everyone. We're looking at this guide today called Rethinking Spaces Through Actions for Kids.
Yeah.
And it's full of inspiring examples.
Yeah, and one thing it really stresses is that it's not about just creating separate kid zones. It's more about recognizing that when you prioritize the needs of, the most vulnerable, like making sure that it's safe and accessible for kids, you're inherently making a better experience for everyone.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole rethinking idea. The guide starts with how, enabling transformation, and I think a big part of that is this major perspective shift.
Yeah, it's about, getting away from just providing for children and moving toward empowering them to actually participate in the design process. Like imagine just asking kids, what would make your walk to school more fun and safe? And then actually using those answers to shape how the city is planned.
So it's about listening to the experts on sidewalk adventures of the kids themselves.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work on a larger scale?
Well, take, for example, Copenhagen's cleaner air network. They recognize that kids, they breathe faster, so they're actually more vulnerable to air pollution. Their solution wasn't just about, just reducing traffic, but they actually designed routes specifically to minimize kids' exposure to that pollution.
So they literally redesigned their city to clean the air for kids. That's amazing.
Exactly. They planted a ton of greenery, and not just any plants, but they chose varieties that were known for purifying the air. And they even considered which direction the wind usually blew to make sure they were maximizing that cleansing effect.
Huh. So it's like they created this giant city-sized air filter with kids in mind.
Yeah. And this concept of a neighborhood for all that's woven throughout this guide, it emphasizes safety, walkability, and engagement. Like picture that, what if we asked, can kids walk here by themselves? It kind of forces you to look at your environment differently, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's about looking at a city map, not just as, streets, but as a child's playground that's waiting to be explored. But making it safe, that's just the first step, right?
Yeah.
We also want to make sure the public spaces are actually engaging and fun to be in. And that's where I think this next chapter of the guide comes in. It's on play, going beyond playgrounds.
Definitely. This chapter really wants us to think of these spaces as destinations, places you want to be, not just places you pass through. And the key is to include things that appeal to everyone, not just kids on, swing sets. It's things like creativity, interactivity, and, that spark of playfulness that as adults we kind of lose sight of sometimes.
So it's about designing these spaces that help us to kind of reawaken that sense of wonder that we all had as kids, no matter how old we get.
Exactly. Singapore has these 3-generation play spaces, and they're a great example of this. They're designed with activities for kids, adults, and older people all in the same space.
3-generation spaces. That sounds really neat. How does that even work?
Well, picture a playground, right? And then right next to it is a fitness area, and next to that is a nice, peaceful garden. So it's not just about having these separate things. It's about making a space where all these different generations can naturally kind of interact with each other. You might have grandparents pushing swings and parents talking while their kids play, and the older folks can enjoy all that energy and laughter. It's about building that sense of community, but through design.
It's so different from, those age-segregated spaces that we see so much. But beyond just the social benefits, are there practical advantages to designing spaces like this?
Absolutely. The guide actually talks about how public spaces that are designed well, they can actually make people feel safer. Remember Jane Jacobs, her whole eyes on the street concept? When you've got people of all different ages using and enjoying a space, there's this natural kind of surveillance that happens, and that can really cut down on crime.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not about needing more cameras or police. It's about creating a space where the community itself feels a sense of ownership and responsibility for what's happening.
Exactly. And that goes right back to the idea of designing playful spaces. It doesn't have to be about spending a lot of money or building something super elaborate. Sometimes it's as simple as adding a colorful mural,
Right.
or putting in some whimsical benches or a fun water feature. Things that just invite people to hang out and interact with each other a little more.
So we've talked about making cities, more engaging and safer for kids. But what about actually getting around? Little legs can only walk so far.
Right. That's where this move creating friendly routes chapter comes in. And it's not even just about like making the sidewalks wider. It's about how we can make walking and biking and even public transit, enjoyable and practical for like families. Turn it into something fun instead of a chore.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting. London, they have this healthy streets plan. And they're really acknowledging how, designing everything around cars actually hurts kids, like the air quality and even, kids' obesity rates are on the rise.
Exactly. And their solution, it isn't about like getting rid of cars completely. It's about making that active transportation so good that it becomes what people naturally choose. Like they're putting a lot of money into these bike networks, but they're not treating them as like an afterthought.
So, like, what makes these bike networks different? We've all seen those bike lanes that are just like paint on the road that disappear after a block.
Exactly. In London, their cycleways are like really well planned out. They connect where people live to the schools, the parks, the shops, everything a family needs. And they're actually separated from traffic, a lot of times with barriers or even green spaces. So it makes you feel safer, more inviting, even for kids who are still learning to ride.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, you should ride your bike more. But it's another thing to actually make it feel like a safe and like doable option for families.
Right. And they're also rethinking, the public transit side of things too, trying to make it more, I guess, attractive to families by adding things like spaces for strollers, making the signs easier to read, letting families board first. It's about recognizing that if you have a stressful commute, it can like ruin even the most fun destination.
It's about taking that stress out of family travel so you can actually like enjoy getting there, not just survive the trip. But I mean, London's not the only one doing this, right? What other cities are like really stepping up their transportation game?
Well, Barcelona, they're tackling this with a pretty bold idea. They're putting in this whole rapid bus transit system, so it's all about speed and efficiency. But here's the cool part, they're actually putting in a bike path right alongside it. And not just any bike path, we're talking high quality, dedicated lane.
So it's not about like picking sides, bike versus bus. They're saying, hey, these can both work together.
Exactly. They're giving people options to fit their needs.
Yeah.
So, you can hop on the bus if you're in a hurry, or and the kids can take a nice, relaxing bike ride right next to it.
So you're making that like healthy and sustainable choice, also the one that's convenient and enjoyable. Perfect.
Yeah.
But sometimes these big changes, they can start small too, right? The guide also talked about Toronto and their school streets project. It seems like a much more kind of local approach. So
Yeah.
what's the thinking behind that one?
Oh, it's so simple but really clever. They basically just close the streets to cars that are right around schools during those drop-off and pickup times. So it creates this much calmer, safer environment for everybody.
So they're like temporarily turning these school zones into little pedestrian plazas.
That's it. And it really encourages more walking and biking. There's less air pollution. It builds that sense of community. Kids can actually, walk or bike to school without worrying about traffic. Parents can actually talk to each other. And teachers can actually start their day without having to deal with, like, a traffic jam.
It sounds like a win-win to me.
Right.
Less stress, healthier habits, and people feel more connected.
Yeah.
And this kind of leads us to another important part of making child-friendly cities, and that's education. How do we get kids ready to be in and, thrive in these new urban environments?
Well, the guide dives into that in the chapter called Learn, Reinventing Education. It really challenges us to think outside of that, traditional classroom box and think about the entire city as one big learning lab.
Ooh, I love that. Okay, but what does that even look like? Are we talking about more field trips to the park?
It's way more than that. It's about recognizing that learning happens everywhere, all the time, especially for kids. They're naturally curious. The guide talks about some key shifts in education that we really need to make this work.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the biggest is personalization. It's realizing that not every kid learns the same way. So we have to be willing to tailor those experiences to each kid's needs and interests. Like, think more project-based learning, incorporating their passions, using technology in new ways.
So we're moving away from that, one-size-fits-all model to something that's a lot more individualized.
Exactly. And another big one is focusing more on lifelong learning. It's not just teaching facts anymore. It's about giving kids those skills and like that mindset to be adaptable and curious and, just be open to learning throughout their lives. The world is changing so fast that we need to prepare them for jobs that don't even exist yet?
It's about giving them the tools to handle whatever comes next, not just memorizing the answers to old questions.
Yeah.
So what other shifts are we talking about to make this whole city as a classroom thing really work?
Collaboration and interdisciplinarity are really important. We've got to break down those walls between subjects and encourage kids to make those connections for themselves. Like imagine, what if they did a project that combined history and science and art to solve, like a local environmental problem?
It's about making what they're learning feel relevant to their lives, their communities.
Right. And lastly, we need flexibility. Learning, it can really happen anywhere, anytime. So it's about creating environments that can adapt and respond to, what each kid needs.
So it's about breaking free from how rigid that traditional classroom is
Yeah.
and embracing that spontaneity and the diversity of the city itself. But do you have a real-world example of a city that's actually doing this well, this whole city as a classroom thing?
Massachusetts has this really cool campaign called Brain Building in Progress. They're doing some interesting things. Basically, they're partnering with businesses and organizations to create learning opportunities in places you wouldn't expect.
Unexpected places.
Mm.
Like what? I need an example. I'm having trouble picturing it.
Okay, so imagine you're at the DMV, right? Like the Registry of Motor Vehicles. Usually it's pretty boring, right? But they've teamed up with this program to create what they call brain building zones right there inside. So while the parents are stuck waiting in line, the kids can do these activities about road safety and like why helmets are important, all sorts of stuff.
That is brilliant. They took something that could be super dull and turned it into something fun and educational. It's like those spy books I used to love when I was a kid, except it's in real life.
Exactly. Kids are always watching,
Yeah.
always soaking up information from the world around them. They've also partnered with the local transportation authority. So, like, they'll put these prompts and questions in subways and at bus stops that encourage the adults to start conversations with their kids about what they're seeing.
So even just a bus ride can become like a learning moment.
Exactly. It's about opening our minds to what's possible, seeing the entire city as this huge web of learning just waiting to be explored.
It's about nurturing that natural curiosity and sense of wonder that all kids have. But let's be real for a second. Redesigning cities, rethinking education, that's a lot. How do we convince the city planners and the people making decisions to actually, get on board with this whole kid-centric approach? And who's going to pay for all of it?
Yeah, that's where the next chapter comes in. It's called Grow, Fostering Communities. And it tackles a really important point, designing things to be family friendly. It's not just like a nice thing to do. It makes economic sense too.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Explain that to me. How are happy families and a strong economy connected?
It's actually pretty straightforward. When cities are designed in a way that's attractive to families, they attract more people to live there, which of course boosts the economy. And families with young kids, they tend to stay put longer. That makes the housing market more stable, and you've got a reliable workforce for local businesses.
And those families, they're spending money locally too, right? At
Mhm.
restaurants and shops and like entertainment venues. It's a win-win for everyone.
Exactly. And the guide actually uses Vancouver as a perfect example of this. Back in the 90s, they started making policy changes to make their downtown area more livable for families.
What kinds of changes did they make?
Well, for example, they started requiring that any new high-density housing that was built had to set aside a certain number of units just for families. And those units, they had to have at least 2 bedrooms and access to some kind of safe play area.
So no more of those teeny tiny overpriced apartments just for single professionals.
Right. They also encouraged developers to build near things like schools and daycare centers and parks so families could easily get to those essential places. It's about making those 15-minute neighborhoods a reality, where everything you need is a short walk or bike ride away. That makes so much sense. By making it easier and more enjoyable to actually live downtown with kids, they're creating a city that's more lively and interesting for everyone.
Exactly. And it's really working. Today, downtown Vancouver, it has 5 times more kids under the age of 15 compared to similar cities in North America that didn't implement those family-friendly policies.
5 times. That's incredible. They've basically engineered a mini baby boom right in the heart of the city.
Exactly. And all these young families moving in, it's breathed new life into their downtown. It's more diverse, it's more prosperous, and just like a more vibrant place to be for everybody. It just proves that investing in families, it's not just the right thing to do, it's a smart move economically,
It's about creating that cycle where everyone benefits. But, we've talked about empowering kids and designing these playful spaces, rethinking transportation and education, but it's mostly been about designing for children. What about designing with them?
You're right. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what the last chapter is all about. It's called Engage, Designing with Kids. And it really gets at this idea that, children, they aren't just future citizens. They're like living in these cities right now. They've got valuable insights that can like really make the design process better.
So it's not enough to just ask a kid what color they want the playground to be. We need to be involving them in these bigger decisions about how we shape the city.
Exactly. And this guide highlights some really cool ways to do that. One that I thought was really interesting was how Antwerp approached creating more places for kids to play. Oh yeah, what did they do?
So instead of just assuming they knew what kids wanted, they went straight to the source. They had all these workshops and meetings with kids of all ages, asking them about how they like to play, the routes they take to school, the places where they feel safe and comfortable, and even the areas that they felt could be improved.
So they were basically treating these kids like junior urban planners.
Exactly. They recognize that kids understand their city in this unique way, a way that a lot of times gets overlooked in those, traditional planning processes. And the things they learned from the kids were really eye-opening.
And what kind of things did they learn?
Well, first of all, they realized that kids, they weren't just looking for your typical playground. They were drawn to places that felt more, adventurous, more challenging, places that sparked their imaginations. They wanted spots where they could climb and hide and build stuff,
Yeah.
make up their own games.
So it was less about installing pre-made equipment and more about just creating those opportunities for like that unstructured play that kids naturally gravitate towards.
Yes, exactly. And those conversations they had with those kids, it actually led to this really neat thing called the play space web. It's this whole network of interconnected play spaces, schools, and youth centers. And it's designed to create these safe and stimulating routes for kids as they're, moving around the city.
It's just amazing how something as simple as like actually asking kids what they want can lead to these like really innovative solutions. But the guide, it goes even further, right? It talks about giving kids an actual voice in like city government.
It does, yeah. Some cities are trying out these children's municipal councils. They're giving young people this formal way to share their opinions and actually be a part of making decisions.
The Children's Municipal Council. That sounds so interesting. How does that work?
Well, it's different in each city, but generally they'll have an election and choose a group of kids. Often they'll represent different neighborhoods or schools, and they act as advisors to the actual city council. So they might, weigh in on stuff related to schools or transportation or public spaces. Some even get involved in the city budget.
Wow, so it's not just about making kids feel like they have a voice. It's about actually giving them real influence and power in shaping their city.
Exactly. It's finally acknowledging that children are stakeholders too. They're part of these communities, and they have really valuable perspectives that can make the whole decision-making process way better.
This has been such an awesome conversation. I feel like I'm seeing things in a whole new light, even small changes, like just imagining what it's like to experience the city from a kid's perspective, like completely change the way we design and build and live in our urban spaces.
It really can. And that's what I love about this whole approach. It's not about forcing one specific solution on everyone. It's about giving people a new framework, a new way of thinking about the challenges we face and the possibilities that are out there.
Yeah, it's about asking ourselves, how can we create cities that aren't just, functional and efficient, but they're also joyful and engaging and just like more humane? Cities that help everyone, no matter their age, tap into that curiosity, that creativity, that sense of wonder.
Exactly. And I think that brings us right back to what we wanted to do with this deep dive. We wanted to equip you with a new lens, a new way to view urban design, one that really prioritizes the needs and experiences of children.
And like we've seen, making that one shift to look at things through the eyes of a child can lead to some really innovative and inspiring solutions.
It's true. From rethinking our whole transportation systems to turning a city into a giant classroom, we've seen cities all around the world that are challenging the way things have always been done and creating these urban environments that are just more playful, more engaging, and just, more livable for everyone.
And what I think is so exciting is that so much of this is still so new. We're only just beginning to see what's possible when we start designing with children in mind.
It's true.
So where do we go from here? What's like the final thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
This deep dive, it was really just a small glimpse into this world where cities are reimagined for children, but it's just the beginning. The real question is, what about where you live? As you go about your day-to-day, start really paying attention to the spaces around you. Think about what you've learned today. What one change, even a small one, could make your city more playful, more engaging, a better place for everyone.
Maybe it's talking to your city council about making a school street, or maybe it's planting a tree, or even just having a conversation with your own kids about what it's like for them to move through the city. Every little thing we do can make a difference.
I completely agree. And remember, the cities that are the best for kids are often the ones that are the best for everyone. It's about building environments where children can thrive. And when we do that, we create a brighter future for all of us.